You've heard the advice before. Look poor, stay rich. Drive the old car, wear the boring clothes, blend in. And you probably nodded along because the data behind it is real, and the millionaire next door research has been repeated enough times that it's become a kind of personal finance scripture. But here's what almost nobody tells you about that advice. Most people who try to apply it are applying it wrong, in a way that quietly sabotages the exact outcome they're trying to produce. Looking poor is not the strategy. Looking poor is a side effect of a strategy that most people who chase the aesthetic completely miss. And if you've spent the last few years driving the old car and skipping the upgrades while your actual net worth hasn't moved the way it should have, there's a real chance you've been performing frugality instead of practicing the thing frugality is supposed to produce. I want to fix that today. Not by telling you to spend more or spend less, but by showing you exactly where the conventional version of this advice goes wrong and what the actual mechanism behind quiet wealth requires that the surface-level version leaves out entirely. Let's get into where your strategy might be backwards. The mistake. Looking poor as identity instead of looking poor as output. Here's the trap. You decide to look poor. You commit to the old car, the modest house, the absence of visible status symbols, and you treat that decision as the strategy itself, as if the act of not spending is what builds the wealth. It isn't. Not spending is necessary but not sufficient. The actual mechanism is what happens to the money you didn't spend. If the difference between the BMW payment and the Honda payment sits in a checking account earning 0.4% interest, you've successfully looked poor and accomplished almost nothing financially beyond that. The Ramsey Solutions study of 10,000 millionaires that gets cited constantly in this conversation found that 61% drove Hondas, Toyotas, or Fords. What gets cited far less often from the same research, the median millionaire invested consistently for decades, captured employer matches without exception, and treated investment contributions as a fixed, non-negotiable obligation, the same way most people treat their mortgage. The car was never the point. The car was the visible artifact of a much less visible behavior, the redirection of capital into compounding assets instead of depreciating ones. If you've adopted the look poor aesthetic without building the redirect the difference behavior underneath it, you have the costume without the substance, and the costume alone produces exactly nothing. The second mistake, confusing deprivation with allocation. A significant number of people who try to apply quiet wealth principles slide into a version of frugality that has no destination. They cut spending, they avoid upgrades, they feel virtuous about the old car and the modest house, and the money that gets saved sits in a savings account, in cash, sometimes literally undeployed for years, because the discipline to not spend was built without the corresponding discipline to actively invest. This is deprivation without allocation. It produces the appearance of the millionaire next door lifestyle without producing the millionaire next door net worth, because the entire financial benefit of looking poor comes from where the unspent money goes, not from the fact that it wasn't spent. Money sitting in a checking account at 0.4% interest while inflation runs at 3% is losing purchasing power every single year. The person doing this for a decade has successfully avoided lifestyle inflation and simultaneously failed to build wealth because looking poor was treated as the finish line instead of the starting point. The correct sequence: decide not to spend on the visible status purchase. Immediately and automatically redirect that exact amount into an investment account. The two steps have to happen together. Step 1 without Step 2 is just unused discipline sitting in a low-yield account, quietly losing to inflation while feeling financially responsible. The third mistake: performing frugality for an audience that doesn't exist. Here's where the strategy gets genuinely backwards for some people. They adopt the look poor approach not because looking poor has become its own kind of status signal within certain financial communities, a performance of discipline for an audience on social media or in a peer group that values the aesthetic of restraint. This produces a strange outcome. People who are technically frugal but psychologically still performing for an audience, just a different audience than the one buying luxury cars.
The 2014 Honda becomes a personality. The decision not to upgrade gets discussed, posted about, referenced in conversation, which means the underlying motivation hasn't actually shifted from external validation to internal calculation. It's the same psychological mechanism of conspicuous consumption, wearing a different costume. The genuinely wealthy people in the research that this advice comes from are not performing their frugality for anyone. They drive the Honda because they ran the math, and the Honda made more financial sense, full stop, with zero consideration of how the decision reads to anyone else. The moment looking poor becomes something you want other people to notice, even in a personal finance community that values it, you've reintroduced the exact psychological mechanism that conspicuous consumption runs on. You've just changed which behavior gets the performance.
The fourth mistake, applying it to the wrong categories. Not every category of spending responds the same way to the look poor strategy, and a significant number of people apply blanket frugality across categories where it actively damages your financial position rather than improving it. Underspending on health, skipping preventative care, delaying necessary treatment, avoiding the gym membership that would meaningfully improve long-term outcomes is not quiet wealth. It's a false economy that trades a small amount of avoided spending now for a much larger cost later, in both money and quality of life. Underinvesting in skills and education that would meaningfully increase your earning ceiling is not quiet wealth. It's capping your own income growth in the name of an aesthetic that was never supposed to apply to investments in yourself. The categories where looking poor genuinely builds wealth are specifically the depreciating, status-driven, comparison-fueled categories: cars, clothing brands, home size beyond functional need, vacations chosen for their Instagram value rather than their actual content. The categories where it actively destroys wealth are the appreciating, capability-building categories: health, skills, relationships, experiences that genuinely expand your capacity to earn or live well. If you've been applying uniform frugality across every category of your life without distinguishing between these two groups, you may have been cutting the exact categories that would have produced the highest return, while protecting the exact categories, the car, the clothes, that were producing the most visible signal of discipline. That's the strategy backwards. The discipline should concentrate where the depreciation in signaling costs the most, not where it's most visible to apply.
The fifth mistake, mistaking the snapshot for the strategy. The Ramsey study, the Millionaire Next Door research, every data set that gets cited in this conversation is a snapshot. It shows what wealthy people look like at one point in time after decades of compounding have already happened. A significant number of people studying that snapshot make a specific error. They assume the visible frugality they're observing today is the cause of the wealth, when in many cases it's simply a habit that persisted from an earlier period when the frugality was genuinely necessary, not a strategy actively chosen at the current net worth level. Here's why this matters. Someone with $4 million who still drives a 10-year-old Toyota is not necessarily applying a deliberate wealth preservation strategy today. They may simply have never updated the habit formed when they had $40,000 and the frugality was load-bearing. The snapshot shows you the car. It doesn't show you whether the decision is still doing meaningful work at the current net worth level or whether it's simply inertia that happens to look identical to strategy from the outside. This produces a specific trap for people trying to apply the lesson literally. They assume that maintaining the exact same frugal behaviors indefinitely, regardless of how their net worth changes, is the strategy, when the actual strategy was never about the specific behaviors themselves. It was about the underlying question: is this spending decision the highest use of this capital right now, given where I currently am? At $40,000 net worth, the answer to that question for almost every status purchase is no. The capital is needed elsewhere, and the compounding runway is long. At $4 million net worth, with the emergency fund built, the investments running, and the children's education funded, the answer to that same question for a specific, considered purchase might genuinely be yes. The wealthy person who eventually buys the nicer car at that point isn't reversing the strategy, they're applying the same underlying question to a dramatically different financial position and arriving at a different answer. Treating frugality as a permanent identity rather than a conclusion you reach by running the numbers means you risk either underspending indefinitely at a net worth level where the math no longer requires it, or, more commonly for people watching this video, assuming that because some wealthy person still drives an old car at $4 million, the car itself is the mechanism, when the actual mechanism was the decades of correctly answered questions about capital allocation that happened before the snapshot was taken.
What the strategy actually requires, done correctly: identify the specific categories where status spending is currently consuming your margin: the car payment, the wardrobe, the home size, the vacation budget calibrated to what photographs well rather than what you'd actually choose without an audience. Calculate the specific dollar differential between the status version and the functional version in each category. Not vaguely, specifically. The exact monthly gap between the leased payment and the paid-off used car. The exact gap between the bigger house and the house that meets your actual needs. Automate the redirect of that exact differential into an investment account the same month you make the downgraded choice. Not eventually, not when you get around to it, the same month, automatically, so the money never sits in a checking account long enough to be absorbed by something else. Stop discussing the discipline. Not because frugality should be secret in some dramatic sense, but because the moment you need an audience to acknowledge your restraint, you've reintroduced the psychological mechanism the entire strategy was supposed to eliminate. Specifically exempt health, skills, and capability-building investments from the frugality framework. Those categories compound in the opposite direction. Underspending there isn't quiet wealth, it's a different kind of expensive mistake wearing the same disguise. And rerun the underlying question periodically rather than treating any specific behavior as permanent. The question was never, should I drive an old car forever? It was, is this the highest use of this capital right now? And the honest answer to that question can change as your actual financial position changes, even while the discipline that got you there remains intact. Looking poor was never the strategy. It was the visible residue of a strategy that requires the redirected capital to actually go somewhere, requires the discipline to be unobserved rather than performed, requires the frugality to apply selectively rather than universally, and requires the underlying capital allocation question to be re-asked rather than answered once and treated as permanent. If your version of this has been the aesthetic without the redirect, the discipline without the destination, the performance without the internal calculation, or the snapshot mistaken for the strategy, you've been driving the Honda and missing the entire point of why the actual millionaires drive one. The car was never the strategy. What you did with the difference was. Looking poor only works if the money you didn't spend actually goes somewhere. Check where yours is going.